Today, February 2nd, is Ayn Rand's birthday, and like every year here at the Ayn Rand Institute, we're celebrating with a special event. And this year also marks 100 years since Ayn Rand immigrated to America. And this is a big deal to Ayn Rand fans because her work wouldn't have been possible anywhere else. But today we're also celebrating a specific point in her journey to America. So it's not just her birthday, but this specific point in her journey, drawing from materials that are housed in the Ayn Rand archives. And at the archives, we have a lot of material related to Ayn Rand's life, and we work really hard to preserve Ayn Rand's legacy. And if you want to learn more, if you already find this work valuable and want to see more of it, you can go to aynrand.org/archives and you can consider supporting our work there. So to discuss some of the issues that we're going to be touching on today is my colleague Brandon Lisi, who works at the archives and who is now going to be telling us what is that special event that we're celebrating today. So Brandon, thanks for joining me today. And please tell us what we're celebrating today other than her birthday.
Well, thank you, Agustina, for that introduction and for highlighting the work that goes on in the archives, because without it, we wouldn't know about anything that I'm about to talk about today. So February 2nd, 1926 is, like you said, not just Ayn Rand's birthday, but it's a very special moment in Ayn Rand's life. About a week earlier or so, she had just gotten permission to enter the United States. She had done so at a U.S. consulate. We'll talk a little bit more. We'll kind of put meat on the bones of that story there. But essentially, she is now traveling westward, and she has a stopover in Berlin, Germany. So this is February 2nd, 1926. She visits her cousin Vera. And what I'd like to do today is really take you behind the scenes of what Rand's life was like at that point in time, and to give you a sense of just her emotions as recounted through the primary evidence that we have here in the archives.
That's very exciting, Brandon, because I'm very fortunate to work at the Ayn Rand Institute and to work with you and to be able to, dive into material at the archives that is just absolutely mind blowing for those of us who, are fans of Ayn Rand. So, I love that we get to share a little bit of that with our listeners and viewers who may not get the chance to see it as often as we do. So, and I'm smiling a lot because, Ayn Rand's immigration story is something that is truly remarkable and just incredible to hear about. So I'm really excited to, dive deep into this specific part of her journey. So, okay, so she, goes to Berlin as a stop in her journey to America. But what is it that Rand leaves behind in Soviet Russia up to the point when she actually decides to leave? What does her day-to-day life look like, and why does she actually decide to leave?
Well, when Ayn Rand is 12 years old, she witnesses one of the most violent revolutions in history, which is the Bolshevik Russian Revolution in October of 1917. She's a young girl who watches as private property is essentially seized by what was then called the sort of military communist government. There was a ensuing civil war in which Rand, her parents, and her two younger sisters, Nora and Natasha, they basically have to flee across thousands of miles to flee to a part of Russia that sort of like isn't at war, which was specifically the Crimea. They endure banditry. They endure periods of starvation. So it's a very grim picture. And then once the sort of dust settles on the Civil War and Rand's family, they settle back into their native city of St. Petersburg, which was, when she was around the time that this was happening, it was Petrograd, later renamed Leningrad. Essentially what happens is that they sort of settle into their new lives. You can read about sort of an approximation of what Rand's life was like in a fictionalized form in her novel We the Living. And what I think you get a sense of is that Rand realized very early on that to write the kinds of stories that she wanted to write, she had decided to be a writer at 9, where there were these individualistic heroes, stories about heroes who are essentially, maybe politically motivated, might be overthrowing a king because they weren't necessarily about Russia. In fact, she says that she didn't set her stories in Russia, but that you could sort of apply those principles to like the current context she was living in, that there could potentially be the perception that like these are seditious stories, and that she could very well pay with her life if she ever published these sort of individualistic kinds of stories, anti-collectivistic stories in Russia. So she knew that her life depended on leaving, but more importantly, that it didn't mean that she could just go anywhere, right? That to really kind of find the kind of readers and to find the kind of people who would appreciate her stories, she sought out the best, and the best in her mind was America.
Yeah, so she was from an early age, she was very, very set on America, and she had been admiring America since she was very young. So, and we have material housed in the archives that shows her admiration for America from this early age. So, can you tell us a little bit more about, what material we have to, to make this assessment, and also what actually that material shows? How is she such a big fan of America?
Yeah, I'll take the second part of the question first. Essentially, Rand talks about how she had admired from afar countries like Great Britain very early on, and this was because of the kinds of stories that she was reading. So she called England the America of my childhood. The other thing that happens is that when in her last year of high school, she does take a course on American history, so she does know a little bit about it. But it's actually American film that shows her what America could be and ought to be, and that it's this ideal civilization on basically the other side of the world that she says is so far from a Russian's context that it's basically like, the way we would think about being on Earth and saying, oh yeah, there's a civilization over on Mars, right? Like that's how far away it is from Rand's context. And what she does is that starting in 1923, as a student at the Russian Film Institute, she starts going to see these movies. There's a sort of cooling off period where some American movies and Western media are being filtered into the country again. And a lot of them are not political, right? And so, in other words, they had sort of passed the Russian censors. So a lot of this material is coming in. But she says, even though it's not political, what she sees in some of these American films, like The Isle of Lost Ships, starring Milton Sills, who is one of her favorite actors, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later. She says that like it portrays a world of purposeful men where philosophical problems have already been solved, and that they're basically going on these grand romantic adventures, and that it was just glamorous, right? And so portraying this view of life as represented in something as simple as a panning shot of New York City, the skyline of New York City. And she would sit through 3-4 shows just to see that same shot over again. And it just goes to show you that like she saw basically a window to another world in the cinema. And so particularly starting in 1923, I don't think it had really occurred to her up to that point that she could realistically get to America. But I think starting in 1923, up until the point at the end of 1925, when she does get permission from the Soviet Union to actually leave, basically that she's dead set, I think, in that 2-year period, to the point where I think some of the archival evidence shows that she was nicknamed America, or that she was nicknamed the American, and that they had a cat named Los Angeles. So it just kind of goes to show you just like how personal this was for Rand. Now, to answer the first part of your question about how do we know about all this, that's really important. So there's a limited amount of archival evidence here, but there are two major primary sources, one very close to the event, and one decades later recorded. So to take that one first, you have Ayn Rand in 1960 to 1961 sits down with Barbara and Nathaniel Brandon to talk about her life for a book project called Who is Ayn Rand? Some of you may be familiar with that. And in it, basically, Ayn Rand sits down for 40 hours and talks about her life and recounts how she was feeling, the details about her life that she recounts basically decades earlier. Obviously, memories fade, so like this is a source of information, but it's important to keep it in context. This is somebody recalling back saying like, okay, this is what I remember happening, 35, 40 years ago, right? Okay, so the other really crucial piece of evidence, and the one that is like super exciting that we mine for information all the time when you and I work together, Agustina, is Ayn Rand's correspondence with her family. That unfortunately, it's like we have one side of the correspondence. Ayn Rand sends a series of letters from about 1926 when she leaves Russia, to about 1939, which is the start of World War II, in which Rand and her family lose contact. But in that period, there are these huge, like just the massive bevy of documents of letters sent back and forth across the ocean. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the letters that Rand sent to her family, right? We have one side of the conversation. We have all the letters that the family sent back to written in Russian, sent to Ayn Rand, but we can glean from the letters that they received like some idea of the conversation, particularly because her parents and her sisters, they do kind of give an account of saying like, oh, in your previous letter you said this, right? So we can have a sense of like the kinds of things that like Rand might have said. So like one thing that I just thought was like super interesting is like her sister says like, you described yourself as a second Columbus discovering America, and it's like, what? Like I wish we had like that letter, right? Like that Rand said like she's describing herself in these terms. So it just gives you a sense of we're kind of piecing this massive puzzle together. Like this is not a collection that sits dusty on a shelf and we just kind of like we're not the janitors of the archive. We are actively working with this information, conducting all this research, trying to make sure that we can piece together this massive story together. And why? Because what it really shows is that Rand was somebody who basically lived her own values. And I think that by studying her life, I think we learn a lot more about the philosophy that I think, has guided a lot of both you and I, and then a lot of the people listening today.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I am a huge fan of the philosophy. I'm a student of the philosophy, and part of my work is trying to apply her philosophy to the best of my ability to current events. But I'm also such a huge fan of her as a historical character. If even if she obviously she wouldn't have lived the life that she actually lived without her philosophy, because like you said, I think she really lived her values. But even if she didn't have such a strong philosophy and it was just an historical character, I would still be such a huge fan because her life is so incredible and so inspiring, frankly, that's part of that we're trying to show the world through the archives. And I'll say, yeah, we're missing a lot of those letters that you mentioned, and then we only have the responses, but we still have a lot of her letters from early on in America, and this is just a little bit after the period that we're talking now. But those listening and watching can find those at the website that I mentioned earlier, aynrand.org/archives. We have the letters of Ayn Rand there, and it's such a treasure trove. It's so incredible, so informative, educational, and also so charming to see, how she wrote, especially at that early age. So Brandon, back to her being in in this period of time where she's deciding to leave America, and embarking on this journey to sorry, no, not deciding to leave America, deciding to leave Russia, and embarking on this journey to get to America. So she had, so many obstacles at an early age, some of which you already mentioned. Living in Soviet Russia, at a brutal dictatorship that is completely antithetical to human life. So, but she also trying to leave was really hard for her as well. So she couldn't. First of all, can you explain to us a little bit of what, in broad terms, what that process of leaving Russia was like? Because people weren't really free to do so, right?
That's correct. So it was a twofold problem. Number one, or actually, sorry, more than two, right? The United States did not officially, as with many Western countries at that time, did not officially recognize the Soviet Union as the legitimate government of Russia. This happens, throughout history where there's a civil war and the new government isn't officially recognized. So in other words, all permission to come into the U.S., she actually had to leave Russia first and then go to America. So that's like one challenge. So not only did she have to get permission to leave the Soviet Union, because that's not something that one can do. You need paperwork and permission from the Soviet authorities to actually go through the border. She describes it in the biographical interviews that I mentioned earlier as you actually would never know, right? So it's not like, oh, hey, like there are these strict rules, like we're just rejecting everybody for X, Y, and Z reasons. No, a tyranny is basically this form of lawlessness, right? And this is something that, we see throughout history, that there are no objective rules to actually follow by, right? There actually isn't a proper procedure that you can follow. It's just anybody's guess or like the arbitrary whim of a bureaucrat basically punching a stamp to decide, okay, whether or not somebody can leave this country or not. And so as a result of that, Rand has to come up with these like reasons to apply. It's something that, you and I were working on an article about. So I think our audience, you'll have to get the full story in that article. But just to give you the highlights, basically she is a film cinema student that may have helped her cases, but in the eyes of the Soviet authorities. But what I'll say is that the official sort of reason why her visa is accepted is that she basically gets permission to visit her relatives that live in Chicago. And basically her family is sort of like helping to sponsor her. The family in Chicago is helping. These are some like, cousins of hers helping to sponsor her. And part of the reason why was because some of Rand's mother's relatives had to help the Chicago relatives like to also escape Russia some years earlier. So it's just sort of like this process of, these Russian immigrants sort of like helping one another, cross all over the Russian border. So that was just to get the Soviet passport, right? She still needs permission from the American consulate to actually come to America. I think we'll save that full story for the forthcoming article that we have on this subject. I hope people read it. But essentially, she actually goes to the American consulate, and it's really interesting. You can read in her letters that she is actually very confident that she's going to get permission, and she does. Although I think a lot of her relatives, I've read that a lot of her relatives seem to think that perhaps she wouldn't get permission. But she actually does get permission to enter the United States at a consulate in Riga, Latvia. So it's not in the Soviet Union, but she has to go over the Soviet border to the nearby country of Latvia, go to the American consulate there. With the United States does have a diplomatic relationship with Latvia at that time. She gets permission, and when she steps out of the embassy, she says she feels like she's walking on air, right? Like that it was the great moment of her life. And I think it's just kind of incredible to think that Rand conveys a lot of confidence for someone who's only 21 years old in these letters, or at least her family says like, oh yeah, you were basically confident that you would get it. We weren't so sure. So it's sort of like secondhand kind of piecing together the information like I talk about. But you can't stress enough that when Ayn Rand leaves Leningrad, this is January 17th, 1926, and then she basically leaves somewhere around January 21st, 1926. She writes back home, or they get a letter back home that says, it really seems like I really one day will be in America. And so it's just like incredible just to see in real time, like have some kind of documented information that conveys like just her enthusiasm and her confidence that she's not only going to make it to America, but that she's going to succeed there.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. The walking on air part, like I find that so charming, so beautiful. I can understand some of what she's talking about as an immigrant to America myself, and I just find that absolutely beautiful. And knowing obviously how the story ends and how much success she achieved because of that decision that she made, that it's even I don't have words. It's just so incredible and wonderful. Okay, so she gets the visa, and then how exactly does she end up in Berlin, and what does she do when she's there?
Well, that's a great question. So basically, the visa stipulates that's like, yeah, you have permission to enter the U.S. and you have like 12 weeks to get there. So it doesn't matter if like, oh yeah, there's a storm across the Atlantic or something happens to you. It's like, no, this is like a limited window that you can now enter the United States. At least that's how Rand describes it, or like how it's described.
Yeah, sorry. We should remind our listeners that there were no planes at that. Well, right. I mean, you could not at that point fly to America. So it was a journey across the ocean.
Yeah. Commercial air travel is quite some decades away, and so this is all by train and by boat, right? So this is all this is the kind of thing that we take for granted in our modern industrialized society. That travel is quick and easy, and it certainly is not. It is still a very dangerous and long. Like you're going to spend a lot of time just traveling to get anywhere in this period in history. But in terms of Berlin, she has a cousin. Her name is Vera Gudzarchik. I apologize if I'm butchering some of the pronunciations here. But basically, we know that she gets there sometime around January 29th, 1926, judging by the dates that are like, because remember, all these letters back and forth are postmarked. So we have some sense of like, okay, if it was sent, if something was sent back by a certain day, we can say, okay, estimate that like about like January 29th, she's in Berlin. And also one of the other really just incredible pieces of Rand's sort of the primary source evidence that we have is Rand's movie diary. Now, remember, like Rand really couldn't take very much with her when she went to America. So one of the things that she said is like she basically has her sister, could you copy over my movie diary for me when you go from like, basically in these letters back and forth. So part of the reason why we have Rand's movie diary is because her sister does actually copy over all this information. So we know starting in like 1922 or 23 or so, we know like the record that Rand kept of the movies that she watched. So we know that on January 29th, she saw a German film. I won't try to pronounce it in German, but it's basically, I think it's like the life of the Maharaja. And then there's another film that she actually sees on her birthday called Der Wilder. Again, I apologize if I'm butchering any of the pronunciation. But she's basically spending time with her cousin. Around that same time, she sends some items back to her family. So, and we'll show a couple of them on screen. She basically goes out and buys postcards of all of her favorite movie stars, right? Because her sisters, and Rand, they were both just big fans of like foreign films. So they buy pictures of actors like Conrad Veidt, who is like just their, basically that was Rand's favorite. And in fact, she says in the biographical interviews that when people she didn't like expressed admiration for Veidt, she was like, basically felt like very personal, like, no, you're not good enough for him. So he was in a film called The Indian Tomb, which she says is like, one of her just all-time, favorite movies. She sends back stockings for her middle sister, Natasha. Natasha writes back, says like, they're almost like silk, like gray and green stockings. And it just goes to show you just like how deprived people living in the Soviet Union were, right? Like there's all these foreign goods, all of these sort of like windows into this other westernized world. And remember, she's not even in America yet, but just experiencing the luxuries that they have in like Central Europe versus in the Soviet Union is like a world away. So she, writes, these detailed letters basically talking about how, there's apparently going to be some storms on the Atlantic Ocean, that she's tried to reschedule her ocean crossing. Her mother is a little concerned, but apparently her mother quotes her back in another letter saying, she's saying, you're telling me I'm panicking again and that everyone's laughing at me. Like, but basically, Rand does, eventually make that journey. And so she spends this like very brief time there, goes from Russia to Latvia, then to Germany, then to France, and then out of France, sails, or not sails, but like goes on a steamship basically across the Atlantic Ocean, departs on February 10th, 1926, and then eventually arrives in New York City on February 19th. So we're basically coming up on the 100th anniversary of like all of these like, different anecdotes or basically all these different events that I'm describing. It's basically been 100 years since they all happened. So it's just amazing, I think, because of the information we have housed in the archives, that all of this is like still known to us, or that there's like actually a record that we can keep track of, and that, we're just honored to make available to you today.
Yes, we're in that anniversary now, and yeah, to reiterate something that you said, to echo that, we're working on an article at the Ayn Rand Institute. You and I are co-authoring an article about Ayn Rand's immigration story. So her story, but from the perspective of her being an immigrant to America and why she chose to do it and what she went through and all of that. So to those listening, I think if you're watching this, you're probably going to be very interested in that article. So we'll announce it when it's ready for publication. So Brandon, you've shown some incredible material. It's so beautiful to see, those cards that Rand collected, and it's such a historical time travel that you're taking us through. So where can our listeners, so we have this article coming up, but if they wanted to learn more about Rand's life at this point, where can they do so?
Yeah, well, the place I would start is the link you mentioned earlier, aynrand.org/archives. We have a lot of online material, basically that's just free to the public, so a lot of, like you said, her letters, some of the planning notes for when she was writing The Fountainhead are currently there. And I'll just tease that, there will be a lot more like that in the future. And what I'll also say is that if you're really interested in like this subject, one of the perks of being an ARI donor, for instance, is that we have these Saturday donor roundtables, in which many cases, a lot of those are archival focused. And we basically play at those roundtables like audio from the biographical interviews, for instance. So people are interested in what we've talked about and they want to get more. I would suggest becoming an ARI member. Go to our donor roundtables, or feel free to email me at blisi@aynrand.org. It's the kind of thing where we're just always excited to, if you have little questions, little tidbits about like the things that you've heard today, feel free to reach out to us or at archives.aynrand.org, because a lot of times the research requests that we get become the basis for new things that we look into. So we actually really appreciate hearing from all of you.
Yes, and I want to encourage our audience once more. If you liked, this very tiny, a story that we told you, and I say that because Rand's story is so rich, and so it's a long life that she lived, thankfully, and it's there's so much that happened. And we're working hard at the archives to preserve that, and to bring that forward, and to help the public get their hands on some of this material, and those interested in Rand's life to learn more about her. And to the main goal that we have at the archives is to preserve her legacy. And I'll say, this is a lot of hard work. I work at the Ayn Rand Institute. I don't work at the archives. I work with the archives for different projects. But Brandon, Audra, and others that work at the archives, their job is very hard, and I know that because I see a lot of what they do, and it's so worth it. And it's truly, the archives is a treasure trove, and they're working really, really hard to make as much as possible later to the public. So please, if you like the work that we're doing at the archives and you want to support it and you want to see more, please consider supporting us, especially today.